Okay, thank you to those attending online our weekly traditional ecological seminar and those in person here. Today we have Rob Croll, who is the policy analyst in the Division of Intergovernmental Affairs at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, otherwise known as GLIFWC. He coordinates the climate change program. It was created with the goal of integrating scientific and traditional ecological knowledge to provide a holistic, culturally appropriate approach to climate adaptation in the Ojibwe ceded territories of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. As a program coordinator, he oversees the activities of the CCP staff, liaison to tribal, state, federal, academic, and NGO partners, and works directly with counterparts in the 11 GLIFWC member tribes. Rob is a member of the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu author team and the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center Consortium leadership team. Prior to GLIFWC, Rob was a conservation officer with Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, Bureau of Land, in the Bureau of Law Enforcement. His educational background includes a BS in Environmental Studies from Northland College and a Master of Environmental Law and Policy from Vermont Law School. So he's originally from southeastern Pennsylvania, but now resides in the 1842 Ojibwe ceded territory of northern Wisconsin. So welcome to Rob Croll as he gives his presentation here. Thank you.
Bujuka Kina Awia, Robin Dinginakaj, Gawin and the Demoscene, Philadelphia and Dunjaba, Anishinaabe Aki Endad, GLIFWC and Denoki. My name's Rob Croll. I'm the Climate Change Program Coordinator for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. I just introduced myself in Ojibwe-moan, which is the language of the Ojibwe people. I need to acknowledge that I am not Ojibwe, but there's a lot of reasons why we use Ojibwe-moan in our work. The first is because part of the mission of GLIFWC is to integrate Ojibwe culture and knowledge into everything that we do, and we recognize that language is the foundation of culture. A second reason is every time we speak the language, whether it's a native person or a non-native person, we are acknowledging that the Ojibwe people are still here. They are still on the landscape. They are still practicing their traditional life ways today. The last reason I do it was actually brought up to me by a colleague. She heard me introduce myself at one of the very first meetings that I came to because I have some fairly serious Ojibwe speakers in my program who kind of forced me to learn. And she said it was so cool hearing somebody from Philadelphia speak her language that it really inspired her to go back and learn it herself. Picking up those languages and cultures are really important. And, we support that however we can. The title of my talk today is Aanji-bimaadiziimagak Aki. It is the title of GLIFWC's Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment version 2. And loosely translated, it means the world is changing. One of the things to recognize, though, is that it's really difficult to translate between English and indigenous languages back and forth. And a lot of context is lost when you do that. For example, that word bimaadizi refers to life, the life on the earth. So it's really the life of and on the earth is changing. I don't usually talk a whole lot about myself when I do these presentations, but it's kind of important today. As noted in the introduction, I'm originally from Southeast Pennsylvania. My family's been in that area since the late early 1700s. So we were right there when the indigenous people in that area were being pushed out. I don't say this out of any kind of sense of guilt. It's just acknowledging that it's been a long process and recognizing that people have been pushed out of their homelands across Turtle Island throughout the formation of and continuing through the entire time of the United States. I came up here to northern Wisconsin in the early 90s to go to college at Northland College, where I actually met my first indigenous people, Bed River Ojibwe, who I went to school with. Before that, if I had met any indigenous people in southeastern Pennsylvania, I did not know it because They, at that time, late 70s, early 80s, people were still keeping a low profile if they were not on the reservation or in what we call loosely Indian country. So I spent a career with the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, conservation officer, field warden. Last couple years were in our Harrisburg office in an administrative position. So really well steeped in agency culture, and an agency that never really interacted with tribes at all, didn't recognize treaty rights. So coming up here to GLIFWC was kind of a culture shock and a really steep learning curve. I have to show a quick disclaimer here because of some of the content of my presentation. This presentation contains traditional ecological knowledge and other information shared by Ojibwe tribal members with us here at GLIFWC under the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. We recognize that any knowledge they share with us is owned by the individual and can be rescinded or withdrawn at any time. It's not the property of GLIFWC. Audio clips are shared in this presentation with the permission of the speaker or their family. Permission for recording has not been given, so recording must be stopped during audio clips. In this case, made arrangements with Sarah that she's going to edit out the audio clips after the presentation before it's shared on YouTube so that we can respect the wishes of those knowledge holders who shared with us. GLIFWC is an intertribal natural resource agency exercising delegated authority from its 11 Ojibwe member tribes to implement federal court orders and interjurisdictional agreements related to their treaty rights. You'll see natural resources is there in quotes. And that's because natural resources as a concept is kind of foreign to the Ojibwe perspective. The term up above, Aanji-bimaadiziimagak, which translates roughly to from where we get life, is a term that was used during the original negotiations of the treaties by one of the tribal leaders who was negotiating treaties with the United States. And it recognizes that what we call natural resources, and we put a dollar value on, this is where all life comes from. And we try to use this terminology today to reflect kind of the Ojibwe perspective when we're working with partners like the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, federal agencies, things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about treaty rights, and we want to recognize that not all tribal nations have treaties with the United States government. Not all treaties are the same, and the rights contained in those treaties aren't the same for every tribe. So these treaties that I'm going to talk about now are specific to the tribal nations that I work for. They're all Ojibwe tribes, but they are not all of the Ojibwe tribes. There are 11 tribes that surrounded Lake Superior, all of whom ceded land to the United States in the mid-1800s in a series of treaties. These treaties were not entered into willingly. They were entered into under duress, primarily by threat of forced removal. But through the foresight of the tribal leaders who negotiated the treaties, they reserved their pre-existing rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the lands that were being ceded to the United States. So you'll see on the right side here, this is Article 5 of the 1837 treaty. The privilege of hunting, fishing, and gathering the wild rice upon the lands and rivers, lakes included in the territory ceded is guaranteed to the Indians during the pleasure of the President of the United States. And it's important that it calls out wild rice because Manuman or wild rice is central kind of to the Ojibwe creation and migration story. It is the food that grows on the water, and it's one of the reasons why they settled here in the northern Great Lakes area. It is also, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, one of the most vulnerable beings we have up here to climate change, and would be an existential threat to the culture if we were to lose it here. So this is the geographic area that GLIFWC works in. It's major parts of the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. And when those states came into being after these treaties were negotiated, they fairly quickly decided that they didn't have to recognize treaty rights and began to regulate hunting and fishing and gathering in the state. And tribal members were often cited or even jailed for feeding their families, which contributed to some of the ongoing trauma that was happening at that time, where they were losing their culture and their language and being sent off to boarding school and all of those things that we've heard about. So in the late 1970s through the early 90s, there were a series of court cases that reaffirmed these treaty rights. They didn't come without a lot of civic unrest. This is the period that we called the Walleye Wars, in which Ojibwe tribal members were going out spearing walleye in the spring, as their ancestors always had, and were being threatened by mobs of people who didn't agree with the practice of treaty rights. People were shot at, beaten up. When I went to Northland College in the early 90s, there was a house a few doors down from me that had a big sign on the porch that said, "Save a walleye, spear an Indian." So even several years later, that feeling was still here. Even now, that feeling is still here. And when tribal members are out spearing in the spring, which is going to happen within the next few weeks, there are always incidents where people are, yelling at them. Sometimes they're shooting over their heads, shining lights at them, just really interfering with their ability to practice their rights. So LCO Band of Lake Superior Chippewa versus the state of Wisconsin is one of those court cases in which the treaty rights were reaffirmed. The court held that the Ojibwe people had the right to continue their way of life on all parts of the ceded territories, not just on their reservations. That needs to be qualified a little bit, because the court held that the practice of treaty rights was to be contained to public lands. So that would be federal or state lands that are open to public hunting and fishing, or lands that are in certain tax exempt programs like managed forest lands that are open to public hunting and fishing. I own 100 acres of land up here on the Bayfield Peninsula, and I can't invite my native friends and colleagues to come practice their treaty rights on my land. They would have to get a state hunting or fishing license to do that. But the tribes have the right to virtually all of the natural resources found in the ceded territories, and they're entitled to a maximum of 50% allocation of harvestable resources. And what that means is anything that has a bag limit or a creel limit. So, for example, Wisconsin has been they've have a program to bring back elk into the state, and they recently, within the past couple of years, have declared hunting seasons, but they've only issued somewhere between 5 and 10 tags a year, and the tribes get half of those tags. So that's how that system works. Fairly uniquely, the tribes have regulatory jurisdiction over their members, both on and off reservation, which is not the practice in a lot of places. So if tribal members were to violate tribal conservation codes, they would be cited into tribal court, even for offenses that occurred off reservation. And it recognizes that the tribes are co-managers of ceded territory resources with the other sovereigns. So the court has actually forced the state and the feds to negotiate with the tribes when it comes to natural resource management here in the Ojibwe ceded territories, in that map that was in my earlier slide. Our GLIFWC climate change program was formed in 2014 with two goals. One is to use a holistic approach to look at climate change impacts on culturally important beings in the ceded territories, using the lens of traditional ecological knowledge combined with institutional science, and to promote the recognition that Anishinaabe knowledge and worldview provide important and needed contributions to the understanding of resource vulnerability and climate adaptation. You'll hear me use that term Anishinaabe probably more throughout the presentation. Anishinaabe is a term that includes the Ojibwe, but also some other tribes like the Potawatomi, the Ottawa here in the United States, and in Canada, the Anishinaabe Nation, Ojibwe, and Oji-Cree. That term's also used to recognize any indigenous people in the United States. So when we talk about traditional ecological knowledge, I know there's been several presentations which have defined it. What we have is just like a little word cloud here from some of our TEK interviews that we've done where we've explained TEK to knowledge holders and asked them to think about what it means to them. And they used words like beings, survival, culture, truth, change, stories, environment, lifeways, language, observations, and Manadug, which is spirits. And we recognize that TEK really reflects all of these things and more, which makes this a full knowledge system that's really different from science. And sometimes it takes a lot of work to integrate the two. I'm going to throw a couple quotes at you. You'll have seen these if you were on the presentation a few weeks back where they talked about the White House guidance document on TEK. First one is federal agencies must conduct regular, meaningful, and robust consultation with tribes, especially in the development of federal research, policies, and decisions that affect tribal nations and the people they represent. Where appropriate, indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge can and should inform federal decision-making along with scientific inquiry. And the administration recognizes the federal government should engage with ITEK only through relationships with tribal nations and native communities and in a manner that respects their rights to control access to their knowledge, to grant or withhold permission, and to dictate the terms of the application. So that goes right back to the disclaimer that I shared at the beginning of my speech. The hard thing is we have this guidance. How do we apply it? We've been doing this at GLIFWC for a while, and we hope that our work kind of shows an example of how to do this, though there's plenty of other ways. The first question we always ask is, how will climate change affect tribes? And it's going to affect them the same as everybody else, and then more. My office is on the Bad River Reservation in northern Wisconsin. I have to cross the Bad River to get here. It's going into flood stage. There's only one road in and one road out. If that bridge goes out, and it does, tribal members that live on the reservation have really no way to get to town, to get food, to get medicine, to go to the doctor, to go to the hospital. When that bridge went out back in 2016, it was out for a month, and people were having to be helicoptered out to their doctor's appointments. So definitely a disproportionate effect by climate change, but also tribal members also depend on treaty resources to meet spiritual, ceremonial, medicinal, subsistence, and economic needs. And so if you're not familiar with some of the activities up here, you see folks harvesting wild rice, harvesting paper birch bark for crafts. I also make canoes out of them, wigwasi-jiman, harvesting maple syrup, spearing walleyes, and everybody in Texas knows about deer hunting. So I'll be talking now about our climate change vulnerability assessments. We have 2 versions out that are available on the GLIFWC website. First version came out in 2018, where we looked at about 10 culturally important beings, plants and animals. That was a small piece of the larger work, which was released this year, just about a month ago, where we look at 66 different beings, culturally important, and really selected for us by tribal elders and knowledge holders, tribal natural resources departments, and then some of the species that GLIFWC monitors throughout our work in the ceded territories. We really tried to integrate science and TEK into this assessment. We started out by using traditional ecological knowledge interviews, both to get guidance on which beings we should look at, but also through a series of unstructured or semi-structured interviews to really get tribal members historical knowledge and what changes they've seen on the landscape over time, stories, songs, cultural information that's shareable because some was not, that all went into the assessment. And then we used the Climate Change Vulnerability Index, which is a Excel-based tool that looks at literature reviews, expert knowledge holder interviews, and creates a numerical score. And then we combined the two and really incorporated the TEK information on abundance and climate variability right into the scoring system in the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. And it did change the score for some beings, not in a huge way, but it also pointed out some differences between what people were seeing on the landscape and what the vulnerability index suggested certain beings' vulnerability to climate change might be. And an example of that is the emerald ash borer, which is a non-local being here that's decimating ash trees. The Climate Change Vulnerability Index doesn't take that non-local being into account because it's not climate related particularly, whereas people were seeing ash just being lost on the landscape in certain areas of the ceded territory. So the results incorporate both science and TEK. And, in the vulnerability assessment, you'll see quotes from tribal members throughout, really detailing what they've seen on the land, what they're seeing on the landscape now, and the changes that they've noticed over time, or changes that they've heard about since their parents' and grandparents' time. These are our 66 beings in the vulnerability assessment, and I'm going to give you about a minute to study the Ojibwe moan, and then there's going to be a quiz at the end. No, not really. But for some of these beings, the names were actually lost, and we had to work really hard to find names for some of the beings that we have in the assessment. One that stands out to me here in the middle is wood turtle, and we had to go to Canada for the name for that being. What we found is that swimmers and plants are the most vulnerable. We used categories that reflect Ojibwe culture, so plants are self-explanatory. Crawlers are typically amphibians and reptiles. Swimmers are fish. Four-leggeds are mammals. Flyers are birds, with the exception of lightning bugs, which are included in with the flyers, and bats, which are included with the four-leggeds because of a story about bats and the game of lacrosse. Plants are vulnerable really because they can't migrate to get away from changes in climate very easily. It takes a long time. And we found that our lakes up here, and especially Lake Superior, is warming up much faster than the air is. So it's really creating a lot of changes, especially in walleye lakes. Ty knows about walleye. When I was talking to Roll, he was not as familiar with and thought they were catfish, I think. Anyway.
Pretty sure they're catfish. Pretty sure they're catfish.
Anyway, what we're seeing is a changeover in some of our more southerly lakes from walleye to bass, and it's really kind of culturally significant because, among other things, bass don't lend themselves to being speared in the springtime like walleye do. 9 beings are classified as extremely vulnerable. That's American marten or wabazashi, moose, mosquito bug, which is Labrador tea, it's a medicinal plant. It's a wetland plant. Mashkigwatig, which is tamarack, and it's the only conifer that actually turns yellow and loses its needles in the fall. And there's a really cool story about why that happens that's in the vulnerability assessment. Waboos or snowshoe hare, which is the most vulnerable mammal. A dikmeg, whitefish. Gichigatig or cedar, which is one of the main medicines of the Ojibwe. Wadunabins or tulabi, which is what Carmen Butler was talking about in that first audio clip. and Manuman, or wild rice, which is the most vulnerable being in the assessment. It's about as vulnerable to climate change as a plant can be, and is, like I said earlier, central to the Ojibwe culture. This is a word cloud that we put together from the interviews, and it's all of the words that were used except for like it, and the. And one of the things that really pops out to me in this is that while we're talking about a hard subject like climate change and the possibility that culturally important beings may migrate out of or be extirpated in the ceded territories, these words are very positive. And really note that the people that we interviewed, while they see that things are changing, they recognize that their culture and they are very adaptable. They've had to be able to, first of all, live up here where it gets down in the -20s in the wintertime, and then we have clouds of mosquitoes in the summertime, but also to be able to maintain their culture in the face of the changes that were forced upon them by colonization. So these are a couple sample interview questions that tribal members were asked in our TEK interviews, and they relate to cultural indicators, kind of, again, like what Carmen Butler talked about in that first quote. When it's time to harvest, stop harvesting. What cues do you look for to see if the harvest of a particular being will be good? And one of the things that we really wanted to see if these things were changing, or if they've changed over time. So it was shared with us that when spring peepers start calling, it's time for walleye season. All of these indicators vary by geography, but this was fairly consistent, and it is starting to change. It's mid-70s here today, and likely this evening there will be spring peepers calling, and most of the lakes still have ice on them right now. Fireflies indicate that deer will be coming around and are ready to be hunted around July 1st. That's a little different than the way we manage deer now by the states, where hunting seasons start kind of late fall or late summer, early fall, and run through the winter. But up here anyway, it's when you'd be able to tell the bucks from the does and know which deer you could hunt, because they're at least starting to develop antlers, because you didn't want to hunt the does with the fawns. And this is also changing. Last year I had fireflies in my yard Memorial Day weekend, so over a month ahead of schedule. As soon as popple or aspen leaves were as big as a quarter, or some say beaver ears, the suckers would run. We know this one didn't match up anymore, probably at least 15 years ago. And those trees are actually leafing out now before the suckers. No, it's the other way around. The suckers are coming before the early, because the water warms up and the trees aren't leafed out yet. So we're going to move to a resource that we helped to create to help indigenous communities think about and adapt to climate change using their own history and language and culture and perspectives. This is Dibaginjigaadeg Anishinaabe Ezhitwaad, which translates to doing something the Anishinaabe way, Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu. This was a team effort. Folks from agencies, intertribal agencies, tribes, academic institutions got together to work on this. It's based on a series of adaptation menus that were created by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. You can see our author team here. Some of these folks contributed maybe to a day of workshop discussions, while others are primary writers. And we have it in a circle to recognize that everybody's contribution matters, and that one person isn't any more important than the others. Our team, our author team, is very consensus driven. We typically don't do a lot of presentations solo, because we want to have all of the perspectives that were involved in creating the menu available when people have questions. So you're getting just a brief taste of this, and if a presentation on the tribal adaptation menu in depth is something that might be interesting for a future seminar, we can talk about that and bring some of the rest of the tribal adaptation menu team in. But why do we need a tribal climate adaptation menu? One of those reasons, like we've been talking about throughout this presentation, is language. The language of resource management, particularly at the state level, is very top-down and very aggressive when you're looking at it from an indigenous perspective. So we have a strategies here of dealing with invasive species. And invasive species were something that our author team really struggled with and talked about for a long time. I mean, several days of workshop and then consulting with elders. So the strategy in one of the NIACS menus is to prevent the introduction and establishment of invasive plant species and remove them. An approach would be eradicate existing populations or seed sources through physical or chemical treatments. Very aggressive, very Western top-down management style language, but also terms that can be really hurtful and offensive. And people went through. So in our adaptation menu, we have a strategy that's very similar. Maintain or improve the abilities of communities to balance the effect of Bakan and Aanji-bimaadiziimagak, which translates to non-local beings and recognizes that these beings aren't from the area. They were probably transported here by humans, and they're existing and doing what they're supposed to do based on their instructions from the creator, but they're not being balanced by their original community. And approach is similar. We recognize that they may need to be removed, but doing it in a way that respects them and makes it really reciprocal relationship with them. One of the perspectives that's really hard for folks, including myself, coming from a state agency background, to really get their head around is the idea of non-human beings and landforms and things like fire as relatives and not resources. We also recognize that decisions for use of our non-human relatives were originally communal decisions that were made with recognition and acknowledgement and reciprocity. And now management decisions are made by institutions and agencies and individuals without input from the affected human and non-human communities. So our tribal adaptation menu really tries to balance these perspectives and still allow tribal communities and their partners to do climate adaptation in a way that's culturally appropriate and respects both the human and non-human around us and looks at humans as part of the ecosystem rather than separate from it. Some of the strategies in here are going to look really different from any kind of climate change adaptation guidelines that you've seen before. Things like considering cultural practices and seeking spiritual guidance. Learning through careful, respectful observation, or Gikinawabi, which is not the same as monitoring. It really means getting out into that environment, into that nature, and sitting with it and learning from it. And then supporting tribal engagement in the environment. Other strategies are going to look really the same, really science-based, so sustaining fundamental ecological and cultural functions, reducing the impact of biological and anthropogenic stressors, supporting beings of concern to the community to withstand climate change, and increasing ecosystem redundancy and promoting connectivity across the landscape. And this is a case study where we kind of used a little bit of everything, the tribal adaptation menu and our GLIFWC vulnerability assessment. The project is called Minisan, which in Ojibwe means islands, connecting Ojibwe ecological knowledge and climate change in the Apostle Island National Lakeshore. The Apostle Islands, or Wenabuju Minisan, is an archipelago on the Bayfield Peninsula in Lake Superior. There are 22 islands, and it's almost fully contained within the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, with the exception of Moninguanakaning or Madeline Island, which is pretty much all privately owned, with the exception of this tiny little corner up at the northeast end, which is a part of the Bad River Reservation. Moninguanakaning is known as kind of the spiritual and cultural center of the Ojibwe Nation. And now it's vacation homes and state park. Winnebuju Minisan lie within Gitchagami Anishinaabe Ezhitwaad, the Big C or of the Anishinaabe or Lake Superior. The Ojibwe people have lived here for centuries, and they continue to have an active relationship with the land, the lake, and the animal beings that live here. And as I just was talking about, they consider those beings relatives and not resources. And the relationship is based on respect and equitable coexistence. A couple of years ago, the National Park Service created a climate change vulnerability assessment for the Apostle Islands. Myself and a couple of my colleagues here at GLIFWC were part of the author team. The Park Service was concerned that climate change is going to continue to challenge their mission to preserve and enhance, particularly the vulnerable landforms in the islands. Very science-based. It did acknowledge that the Ojibwe people were here and some historic uses of the islands by people, but didn't recognize that those uses are current and ongoing, and that Ojibwe TEK still plays a part in the management and relationship with this area. Once the vulnerability assessment was published, they kind of recognized they needed a tool to be able to share it with the public, and they contracted with a friend of mine who works for University of Wisconsin Extension to create an educational project to outreach their climate vulnerability assessment, integrating Ojibwe TEK and promoting stewardship for the public, students, and teachers. The original project deliverables were teacher workshops, signage, and brochures with a timeline of July 2019 to December 21. We all know what kind of happened right at the beginning of that with COVID, and what Kat Techman, who's the person who was the primary contractor on this, decided on was to go to a virtual online resource. But first, she took her project through our Tribal Adaptation Menu workshop process to receive guidance on how to integrate Ojibwe perspectives into this very scientific project. It was the first educational type project to go through a TAM workshop, and she actually brought it to two. The first one to get guidance on how to integrate the TEK into this project, and the second one was to actually test out the interpretive and educational concepts with Park Service staff to make sure it was, acceptable to them and something they were going to want to use in their outreach. And also, quite frankly, to teach them about some of the Ojibwe perspectives that they've been missing, even though they've been managing this area since the 1970s. As a result of the workshop, Ojibwe values were used to guide Minisan content and design. Central to it was infusing Ojibwe Moan into the project, emphasizing respect, relationships, responsibility, and reciprocity, recognizing beings as relatives and not resources, interpreting climate change based on the interconnectedness of the four orders of creation from the Ojibwe creation story, which is land, rocks, water, those physical landforms, then followed by plants, which rely on that first order, followed by animals, which rely on the plants and the land, and then finally and least by humans, which rely on everything else, but none of the others really rely on us. And that's central in the Minisan outreach, recognizing that. Incorporating the Ojibwe Seven Grandfather teachings and project development, and then applying TEK, and science for cross-cultural perspectives. And so like I said, this is a web-based product. It relies really hard on a lot of really good photography on the islands to really represent the landforms. And a secondary goal of this, if you saw from the map, the Red Cliff Reservation is just across the water. Those islands are in view from the reservation. And there are kids growing up on the reservation that have never been and may never get out to those islands because they lack the resources to do it. So at the very least, this gives them a physical representation of what their homelands look like. This is just the front page, the different ecosystems and how you would access the website. Again, we look at the landforms, written audio of the ecosystem in both Ojibwe, Moan, and English, 360-degree panoramic photography, different orders of beings and different ways to think about the different landforms and climate change and how it's going to impact them. So this is an example of a human order section from the website, talking about Nabi or water. And it contains take action strategies based on the TAM, the Tribal Adaptation Menu, more images, and then an educational message offered through interpretive storytelling style. So in this case, if the print is really small, it says Indinawe-maganadug, which means all of my relations. Climate change is affecting the quality of our water and our relationship to it. We are all related and share the need for clean water. It's our responsibility to take care of Nabi because Nabi takes care of us. So take action. Learn about how climate change and humans are affecting water quality and water quantity. So we have the two resources, which again are complementary. The vulnerability assessment itself shows climate impacts on landforms and plant species based on scientific ecological knowledge. It acknowledges historic uses. Ojibwe Moan's included, but just in the glossary of plant names. And the adaptations actions are very focused on what can park visitors do to mitigate their activities and preserve some of the landforms in the park. Minisan website really connects those climate impacts through this Ojibwe creation story, looks at climate vulnerability based on both science and TEK, integrates historic and contemporary uses by Ojibwe people, including treaty rights. Ojibwe Moan is infused throughout. The values of respect, responsibility, and relationships, reciprocity, and it's interactive and updatable. And we're finding this website is really being used by a lot of park visitors to learn about the area before they come here. It's a resource that we share in presentations like this. And it's also something that the Park Service uses, although, as you'll note, their logo isn't on the website. These are the partners that were involved in the Minisan project. So you can see that the Bad River and Red Cliff Band were very involved with this project. It wouldn't have gone forward and it wouldn't have been published without their approval. GLIFWC, Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, the Extension, and our Tribal Adaptation Menu team. With that, I'll say miigwech bizindawieg. Thank you for listening to me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for taking the time to go through that presentation with us, Rob. I knew GLIFWC was doing a lot of good work, but all of the things you shared, it's even more impressive than I thought. So it's great. So now we can open up to some questions. Anybody in the room have a question? Lindsay?
Thank you for sharing everything, and it's cool to hear about the climate adaptation strategies, so people can continue the way of life there. I was just curious, how did you get to work with GLIFWC? How did you go from the boat commission there in Pennsylvania, to working with them? And also, could you just speak to what's important for a non-tribal person to do to work with these people and be effective and respectful?
Sure. So, as I said, I retired from Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission in about 2012, and we left Pennsylvania and we ended up in Seguin, Texas. So I was there for about 6 years, and I wasn't any good at being retired. So I started coming back up about 2015 and actually guiding sea kayak trips in the Apostle Islands. And it got me really wanting to be back up here again. I connected with some of my old friends. And I also recognized that I had time and money to go back and get a master's degree that I never had while I was working. So I went to Vermont Law School and worked on a master's in environmental law and policy. And the two courses that really stuck with me were one on law and policy for climate change, and the other one is Native American law and kind of the really messy legal system for Native Americans in this country. When I was just about finishing up, this position with GLIFWC popped up. I had known about GLIFWC since the early 90s. I did an internship at the Red Cliff Tribal Police Department, and the police chief there had been former chief warden here at GLIFWC. GLIFWC has its own conservation warden force. We work outside the reservation in the ceded territories. We're the conservation law enforcement force that enforces the tribal codes off reservation. And I actually do a little bit of work with them when I'm not doing climate change stuff. But this position with GLIFWC came up. I applied for it, was lucky enough to get hired. I actually got interviewed by my climate change team, so the people that would be working for me, which was really unique, including a couple of really critical tribal members who kind of made it their job to really mentor me and tutor me. And that's part of it, is really recognizing that to work successfully in tribal communities, it's all about creating and building relationships, going in there with humility and recognizing that you're really there to learn from them. I went up to a sugar bush 2 weeks ago and sat down with an elder up there. We have a project looking at climate vulnerability for sugar maple and how we can preserve that tradition. And I asked him, what does he want from science to help him adapt to climate change in his sugar bush? And I'm not going to give you the exact quote because he's kind of earthy, but he said he didn't need anything from science. What he really needed was somebody to protect his treaty rights. So it's recognizing that those perspectives are out there and being willing to be uncomfortable is really important, and recognize that your learning curve is really steep.
We have any questions online, Sarah?
So we don't have any questions, but we do have a comment. Richard Myers said, thanks. I'm in USFS in South Dakota, and thank you guys' approach to stewardship is exemplary of what I could only wish for South Dakota state relationship with the, I'm so sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, the Ositai Sakowin tribal nations.
Yeah, so I will speak to that a little bit, because the state relationships with the tribes here in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota have been really back and forth. From the mid-late 1800s on, when the states came into being, there really was no relationship. The relationship was really, we need to control the tribes. We need to see if we can get rid of the tribes. It's gotten better. It still has a way to go. We try to help the states particularly improve their relationships, and it's worked. to a certain extent, but it's a daily thing. I mean, I have projects sitting here on my desk where we've been asked to help them integrate TEK and work with tribal nations here to get things like the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant, the America the Beautiful grant that's out there. And I'm about to tear this thing apart because, we tell them from the get-go, you need to bring the tribal nations in on this from day one to develop these proposals. And collaborating with GLIFWC isn't doing that. You need to go to the individual nations. And unfortunately, it's taken them a while to get that message, but we're going to keep hammering them.
We have another online question. What encourages Native Americans to even want to work with Western scientists?
That's a really good question. I mean, there are some that don't. There are some that absolutely don't. But the recognition is that we all have to live in this world. And as much as the traditional knowledge is useful and important to the life way, they also recognize that science has provided a lot of important things and will continue to do that. And the best possible outcome is to use indigenous knowledge to influence science to make it better for all of us.
Just curious how you see the new generations in the community related to how they see coexistence with nature. Same vision that their parents and grandparents have, or that have changed because of globalization. I don't know how you see that.
That's a really good question too. What we're seeing really here in the communities that we work in is actually reflective of society as a whole. The kids are less likely to get involved with things like hunting and fishing and gathering unless their parents do it or unless the tribes have programs to teach them. And part of the reason is that a lot of that knowledge was lost, particularly during the boarding school era, where you had whole generations of people that were separated from their culture, and now it's their kids and grandkids. But the other reason is the same reason why we're seeing less participation in those activities throughout society, and that's because there's so many other competing activities and they're all busy, kind of like this. So I know all of the tribes that we work for have very active programs to bring their youth in, to get them involved in traditional and cultural activities again. And some do better than others. They all do pretty well, but some do better than others. It's hard.
I think we're good on questions. Well, thank you very much, Rob. It was wonderful talk, and I'll reach out to you after this, but thank you so much.
Sounds good. Miigwech for having me.